Today we'll be showing our event, Manga Mania. We invited 3 prominent speakers to discuss manga history and their experiences in Japanese to English translation. Our in-person guest is Frederik L. Schodt, the author of multiple books on manga and the translator of classics such as Astro Boy and Ghost in the Shell. Joining us virtually is Matt Alt and Hiroko Yoda. Matt Alt is a Tokyo-based localizer, reporter, and writer. His translations are found in many video games and manga. His writing is in The New Yorker, Wired, Slate, The Economist, and 1843. Hiroko Yoda is the president of Alt Japan, a Tokyo-based company specializing in the localization of Japanese entertainment content for foreign audiences. We hope you enjoy this video recording and will join us in future events as they happen either in person or online.
Welcome. I am delighted to, get started with this. That everyone's giving me the eye that says, let's get started. So, okay, let's get started. I am delighted to give sort of 3 messages on behalf of Japan Society before we get started. First is just introduce society. Second, introduce our wonderful hosts at DG717. And then the part that you're all waiting for are 3 absolutely wonderful speakers on a topic that you all probably know and love, Manga Mania. So first, I'm John. By day, I'm lecturer in the business school at UC Berkeley. I teach on business in Japan, including modules on this very topic. I just assigned Matt Alt's book to my MBA students. So this is hot off the presses. I'm a member of the board at Japan Society. We are sitting, or at least 50 of us are sitting here at DG717, so 717 Market Street, startup community space operated by our supporters Digital Garage for startups focusing on Web3, fintech, and health and wellness. I think that covered it, yes. And then, all right, with that. So the Japan Society is 117 years old. We do probably 1 program a week. If you're here for the first time, check out usajapan.org/events for our various programs. If you're interested in studying Japanese, our language coordinator, Yu Higashizawa, waving her hand in back. She's here if you're online. Well, I won't drop your email over a Zoom call, but anyway, write to us. We do have one event upcoming that I want to let you know about. July 14th at Stanford, we will host our annual Japan-US Innovation Awards in person at Stanford. We have a great list of companies and speakers who will be there. So if you're interested in the topic of innovation, by all means, please check that out. With that, all our programming messages are out of the way. So I'm delighted to introduce 3 speakers, and I'm going to introduce them just in the order of appearance, not to give prioritization. Fred Schodt, long time, I'll call you an ambassador. Really, because the translator's not quite right, interpreter's not quite right. Ambassador for the medium.
It's complicated.
It's in the best possible way. Manga Mania is here. If you're wondering what the book looks like, I brought a copy. Fred gracefully signed it. Matt, you're not here, so I can't do that to you. So Fred's here with me live in person. On Zoom, we have sitting next to each other side by side, Hiroko Yoda and Matt Alt. That would be Hiroko on the right, I'm assuming.
Yes.
So Matt, some of you may know, is the author of Pure Invention. Hiroko Yoda is president of Alt Japan, which focuses on translation and sort of market entry and support. And you'll hear more about what Alt Media does. The 2 of them are side by side, which means we can only have 1 set of audio problems for this.
And hopefully none.
Yeah. So anyway, it's a wonderful, wonderful group. And with that, I'm just going to introduce the order of things and then get out of the way. First, we'll have about 10 minutes from Fred here live from Fred's computer. We will turn things over to Hiroko, and then Matt, last but not least, will sort of bring up the rear, all on the topic of Manga Mania. And I can tell the audience wants me to stop talking, let the professionals take over. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Fred. We will be taking questions in person and over Zoom, I believe, and I will defer to the staff as to how they handle those. Those questions will be relayed to me and I will relay them on stage. So if you are in the audience and you have a question, don't hesitate to drop it in the chat, and we will try and get to those as best we can. With that, Fred, please.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Well, we're here, and it's an honor to be here and to be invited by the Japan Society here in San Francisco. I could talk for days and days about this subject, but I've been trying to focus it down. And I will be talking a little bit about the Bay Area and also a little bit about the Japan Society. I'll sneak it in. But anyway, there's one thing about the title of this talk. It says Conquered America. And I don't see it that way necessarily, because I think manga have become part of American culture. And that's why you can see on this New Yorker magazine cover, this is 2006. It shows an average American teenager. And you'll notice in the left side of the image down at the bottom next to algebra is manga. So in 2006, basically, manga had sunk into the teenage brain. And I'm not exaggerating. Anyway, we'll see if this works. And here we go. Well, there we go. I was in Japan in 1977 or so, working as a professional translator at a fairly well-known translation interpreting company in downtown Tokyo. But I was obsessed with manga and had been for a long, long time. And when I was there, around that time, I had 3 friends and I put together a group called Dadakai. And we really didn't know what we were doing, but we put together a group to try and translate Japanese comics and then get people outside of Japan to somehow appreciate them. And what I've learned since then is that actually the translation was just a subset of localization. The real problem was getting people outside of Japan to read them, especially in the United States. So I was particularly a fan of a work by Osamu Tezuka, and so were the other members of Dadakai, the group that I belonged with. And I was particularly enamored of this work by Tezuka Osamu, who's known as the god of manga in Japan. And he could also be called, frankly, the king of animation, because he started the first, or created the first 30-minute animation TV series in Japan, Astro Boy, which you probably notice I'm a big fan of. Anyway, at Dadakai, there were 4 people, Shinji Sakamoto, Midori Ueda, myself, and also a friend named Jared Cook. And we thought, well, who are we going to translate? Where are we going to start? What are we going to do? And we came up with some manga artists that we liked their work. One was Matsumoto Reiji, and we actually translated some of his works that have never been published to my knowledge, but we just did it in script form, which is quite easy to do. But we were really fans of Tezuka, so we wanted to translate this fabulous work called Hinotori in Japanese, or the Phoenix in English. And at that time, it was consisted of 5 volumes that were out. Today, it's more like 12. And we managed to go to Tezuka Productions, and we thought we were just going to meet the manager and ask for permission to translate this. But we actually met Tezuka. And I should say that kind of changed my life. Maybe I need some water here. And if I could get this slide thing to work, that would be even better. Let's try this. Anyway, we put together basically what we thought might be possible with a Japanese comic. And the translation we did was unique in the sense that Jared and I took roles. We took characters that we liked, we assigned them to each other and translated it that way. But as I said, the translation is not the hardest part. The hardest part is creating something that people are willing to read. So we basically did what we thought we could do, which is we used whiteout to white out the Japanese text. And then we actually wrote in by hand, because in American comics, you always have to have, at that time, you had to have hand lettered text. And I should say at this point, there are no computers that people are using. They're not even facsimiles, really. This is a long time ago. This is 1977 or so. So we put together something, and we did all 5 volumes of the Phoenix that existed then, and we delivered it to Tezuka Productions, and it sat and collected dust for 25 years until it was published finally here in San Francisco by Viz Media starting in 2002. So that was the beginning of trying to translate Japanese manga for me and for Dadakai. Because I met Tezuka, I became quite friendly with him, and he was always very kind to me. And I worked for him for a long time, and I felt quite close to him until his death in 1989. And actually, I put out a book you can see here on the screen. It's called The Tezuka Osamu Story. It's a 900-page book translated. It's drawn by Toshio Ban, who was actually an assistant for Tezuka in Japan. So he could draw in Tezuka's style. But if you ever want to know anything about Tezuka, who is known in Japan as the god of manga, that's the book to read. I have a copy on display in the back of the room. Unfortunately, it won't appear in Japan or other countries. But anyway, in the book, I was surprised because I translated this 900-page book in 2016, and I came across this page where it actually shows me interpreting for Tezuka as part of this biography of Tezuka. And we were visiting Ward Kimball, who's a famous Disney animator. And I was interpreting for him, and you can see me wearing this strange jacket. I mean, what was I thinking in those days? I don't know. But anyway, we're going forward here. I often think about how things have changed, because through Tezuka, kind of a whole world opened up to me personally. And I got to know many, artists by name. And often Tezuka would say, hey, we're going drinking, let's go to a club or something, or let's go eat or something like that. And I would meet all these artists. And it was just an extraordinary experience. And I was reflecting on that the other day because I think Matt and Hiroko have already seen this photograph, but it was taken in 1983. And you can see Tezuka in the right far back with his beret on. And he had hosted this party. But so many of these people have passed away. And Tezuka had a lot of, I would say, proteges. And many of the people in the photograph were proteges of his, and they may have worked with him. And many of them have also started to pass away. Ishinomori Shotaro, who has the peace sign, he passed away. Down at the bottom, Saito Takao, or Takao Saito of Golgo 13, he passed away not too long ago. Also Monkey Punch, who's right next to him with his wife. Monkey Punch passed away just a couple of years ago. And then in addition, of course, Tezuka is gone. And more people have started to leave, who were these initial pioneers who helped develop what I like to think of as these long arc story manga that Tezuka helped to pioneer. Of course, he wasn't the only one doing this, but as you can tell by his appellation of the god of manga, he had a huge influence. At the same time that Dadakai was translating The Phoenix, there was another group in Tokyo, actually, that was working on translating a semi-autobiographical, slightly fictionalized account of the bombing of Hiroshima by Keiji Nakazawa. And they were working on Barefoot Gen, or Hadashi no Gen, which is the title in Japan. And the idea was to translate this and then ship it to the United States, mainly to churches and anti-war groups, because this was the height of the anti-nuclear movement in the United States. And originally it was a group of both Americans and Japanese and other foreigners who got together as volunteers. And they did all this work, and they developed their own way of translating this work, which I'll show you in a second. This is a widely translated work now around the world. But they also had to go through this process of establishing a method to make it readable to non-Japanese. So I think you can see here one example. One advantage they had, and I should say, myself and Jared Cook, whom I mentioned earlier, we translated the second volume, which is in this slide here. There are actually many people who've worked on the translation of Barefoot Gen, and it's been retranslated not too long ago. So it's definitely a cooperative project. But you can see one of the issues that they ran into was, again, how to get it readable, how to make it readable to a non-Japanese audience. And they were fortunate in the sense that Nakazawa used a very orthodox page layout. He most of his panels were square, and therefore you can cut them out and you can move them around on a page. You can make it so that people read from left to right rather than right to left, which is the Japanese format. You have to do a lot of tricks sometimes. And sometimes if there's dialogue within a panel, you can't just use translation tricks to make it work. Sometimes you have to flop something. But in those days, flopping something or mirroring something was very difficult. It was expensive. So with the project Gen, what they came up with was just to mirror image just a specific panel. And you can see in yellow, this is outlined here. And if you look at these two outlined panels, you can see they're a mirror image of each other. And that was a technique they used. But it was way too expensive to flop the whole page. So that was the first work that I was involved with Jared Cook. We translated volume 2. So that was the first work that was actually published. The second work that I was involved with that was published, the Barefoot Gen volume 2 was in 1979 or 8. The next one was The Rose of Versailles, which is probably the most famous girls comic in Japan, done by Hiroko Yoda. And I actually translated by myself 2 volumes for a tiny outfit in Tokyo. And the audience was not Americans. The audience was actually Japanese people who wanted to test their English and wanted to improve their English. And unfortunately, it didn't sell very well. It went out of the company, basically stopped publication after 2 volumes, but it would have gone on to over 8. These are paperback books. But ironically, Jared and myself had also translated separate from Dadakai. We'd done a rough translation for a company in Tokyo that was related to Sanrio. And there was a feature film being made in Hollywood, and our rough translation, which was penciled in on the actual copies of the pages, was then sent to LA, where it was turned into an acceptable script for a movie, a feature film, and then it was shot in Versailles in France using British actors and dubbed back into Japanese and shown in Japan. So, but this again used partial flopping, and sometimes they were able to rearrange the panels, but that with girls comics, that's very difficult because girls comics then and now are very difficult to isolate panels. They use very abstract layouts. So I came to the conclusion then that rather than trying to translate manga, we'd never get anywhere. And what we needed really was a book about manga. So I started doing research for a book about manga and trying to show how interesting it is and so forth and so on. And that was eventually published as Manga Manga, The World of Japanese Comics in 1983. And just to give you an idea of how different things were, in 1983, I had a discussion with my editor, Peter Goodman, whom I'm very indebted to. And I wanted to use the title of Japanese Comics, A New Visual Culture. And he said, no, let's go for something with a little bit more pizzazz. Let's go for Manga Manga, The World of Japanese Comics. And I said, what? I said, put that in libraries and they're going to file it in paper catalogs in those days. That's what they had, paper catalogs. And it'll go under like manganese or be put right next to manja, the Italian or something, because nobody knew what manga meant in those days. Anyway, I introduced Japanese manga in all their glory. And I was able in the back to make excerpts from 4 works and try and make them as readable as possible to Americans. So basically, most of them were flopped. Some of them were works that we had done with Dadakai, and others were works that I had total control over the layout and also how I would do it. So almost everything is flopped and mirror imaged. And I learned lettering so I could be a semi-professional letterer. Unfortunately, somebody said later that, oh, the excerpts were really great, but the lettering really sucked, which really hurt because I tried so hard to become a professional letterer. So anyway, then in 1981, actually, even before Manga Manga came out, I was in San Francisco, and there was a lot of activity centered around Barefoot Gen, especially by Leonard Reifus, who owned a small company here in San Francisco called Educomics. And he made an abortive attempt to Americanize Barefoot Gen for an American audience, to make it like an American comic book. And that failed. So then Leonard, working with the Project Gen members here, included myself and also Alan Gleason and his wife at the time, and and Leonard's girlfriend at the time, I think. We found basically this work called Ore wa Mita, which is by the same artist, but it's the predecessor to Barefoot Gen. And the beauty of it is instead of thousands of pages, it was a one-shot work. It was only about, I think, maybe 42 pages long, which is perfect for an American comic book. So Leonard published that as I Saw It. And you can see, this was sort of the ideal of what people were, at least I was dreaming of, and I think Leonard and a lot of people were dreaming of, as how to localize a Japanese comic or manga. Everything was flopped. So everything is a mirror image of Japan, which means you get with a lot of left-handed people in the drawings. But it was colorized, and it was also professionally lettered. And I didn't translate it. It was translated by Alan Gleason, my friend. And I helped with the sound effects. I drew the sound effects in English and helped translate them. And also, I think I was kind of a pusher, pushing Leonard to go big on this project. And I think he somehow found, he was able to print 40,000 copies of this. And for decades after that, his parents' garage, I think, were filled with copies. I felt really bad about it, but he says he forgives me because I really encourage him to go big. Now we're jumping ahead. That was in 1982 that I Saw It came out. We're jumping ahead to 1987. And here we get to something that I didn't translate at all, but it has a relationship to the Japan Society obliquely. There were two comics that came out that really caught a lot of people's attention from Japan. And these were localized. Everything was flopped. They could be read like American comics, although they were not colored. They were not colorized. And one was Lone Wolf and Cub. In Japanese, it's Kozure Okami. And you'll notice on the cover here, it's actually done by Frank Miller, who's a famous American comic artist. And this is heretical in Japan. You don't do that. You don't use other people to draw your covers. But in the United States, it really helped this work get a lot of attention and get off the ground because he was so famous. And the translator for this was none other than Dana Lewis, who at one point was the president of the Japan Society here in San Francisco. So you see, the Japan Society has actually been sort of the epicenter of a lot of these efforts. The other comic on the other side, Mai the Psychic Girl, was actually published in the San Francisco area. And it was published, or the project was initiated by Viz Comics, which is today one of the largest publishers of Japanese manga in English. And it was formed by Seiji Horibuchi. And since they were just starting out, they had an arrangement with Eclipse Comics, which was just north of here in the Russian River area. And this was actually got a lot of attention too. But this was translated by Satoru Fuji, who has passed away, and also not Dana Lewis, but James Hudnall, who has passed away. Both of them have passed away. Anyway, this was a big step forward in localizing Japanese comics. In 1995, I was actually asked to translate Ghost in the Shell by Tauren Smith, who had created a localization company in San Francisco. And Tauren probably doesn't get enough credit for the work that he did localizing Japanese comics. And I think actually Dana Lewis was asked to do this, but for some reason didn't want to do it. So I wound up doing it. And I love this work. I think this is sort of the pinnacle of flopped, imaged, localized manga. And the lettering was by Tom Orzechowski, who's a famous letterer, because American comics at that time had to be all hand lettered. And this did really well, like a lot of Japanese manga, because there was an animated film associated with it. And that's true of Akira and also Ranma 2/1 or Ranma 1/2. Those had animation behind them, which really propelled sales. And I'm very proud of the work I did on this. And it's a beautiful work. It's still being published by Kodansha USA right now. In 2002, I was asked to translate the Astro Boy series by Dark Horse. And I hear yes, can I have just one or two more slides? I knew this was going to happen. I could talk for days about this stuff. Anyway, this is a 23-volume series, which I did, and I'm very proud of. This is still available, I believe. It's a great work. And then in 2009, I was asked to translate Pluto, which is based on one Astro Boy episode, and it's recast by a new artist, upcoming artist, not upcoming, he's a famous artist in Japan now, in an adult format. And I translated it again with Jared Cook. And this was a huge amount of fun. And that brings us up to sort of end of an era, because from this point on, actually, Pluto itself was not flopped. It was not mirrored. And basically from that point on, almost everything is not flopped anymore. It's a huge change in the manga business. And if I left anyone's name out, oh, Stu Levy in LA put together Tokyo Pop, which also really propelled the non-flopping trend in manga, because they found out that American kids were so indoctrinated with manga that they had no problem reading right to left instead of left to right.
There's a theme in here that I suspect Matt and Hiroko can pick up on.
Yeah,
which is
I don't want to say anything more.
When you translate, well, no. To what level do you translate? And then there's excerpts in Pure Invention that actually deal on this very specific topic. So this is a great segue point. With that, I want to turn things over to first Hiroko, live from Japan. So Hiroko, over to you.
Hello.
Let me share Hiroko's screen. Thank you for that, Fred.
I'm sorry I went on
thank
too
you very
long.
much.
No.
Interesting.
Hiroko's going to talk about this a little bit from the standpoint of how Japanese people saw manga, I believe, in the 70s and 80s. So take it away, Hiroko.
Before I start, let me wear my glasses. I'm getting that age. Okay. My name is Hiroko Yoda. I was born and raised in Tokyo. I'm also the co-founder and the current president of Alt Japan Co. Limited, which is a localization company based in Tokyo. We started over 20 years ago and specialized at first in video games. But we have done a lot of manga translations over the years as well. The titles we worked on include Young Magician for the CMX imprint, Nura, Rise of the Yokai Clan for Viz, Dorohedoro, also for Viz, and my personal favorite, Doraemon. We translated that in its entirety, 15,000 pages, for the Kindle ebook release. I grew up reading Doraemon, and in fact, it was the first comic that I ever read as a little girl. I specifically remember that the girl next door came up to me and said, "Do you want to read something fun?" And that was the first volume of Doraemon. I was 6 years old and never imagined someday I would grow up to translate it. As a schoolgirl growing up in Japan in the 1970s, I read other manga, such as the shoujo classic Candy Candy. But after I graduated from elementary school, my parents, especially my dad, started telling me not to read manga, to read books instead. Like many of his older generation, he was simply concerned about the trend of reading manga that was sweeping Japan. For instance, when you got on a train, everyone from schoolgirls to salarymen were reading comic magazines. Today, everybody looks at their iPhones. But back then, it was manga. It was typical of the older generation to see manga as immature. And this put a damper on my manga reading. But I also remember the whole family gathered to watch the anime show Sazae-san, which was a classic post-war animated sitcom. So you might say Japanese society, or at least grown-ups, weren't against illustrated entertainment, but rather ambivalent about it. When I went to college at the University of Maryland, College Park in the mid-1990s, I noticed that many students were reading manga, not just Americans, but people from all over the world, such as France or Venezuela or Africa, had read manga like Candy Candy and The Rose of Versailles when they were young. So I was able to use manga as an icebreaker. Looking back, I think this was the beginning of the world's love affair with manga. There's no ambivalence about manga in Japanese society anymore. Today, it's cornerstone of what's called cool Japan, and even Japan's face to the world. Recently, the Hollywood Reporter called anime Japan's most bankable entertainment. And anime is fueled by manga. That is why it's so vibrant and continuing to grow. It's fascinating to me as a Japanese to see how far the manga has come. Here in Japan today, manga are everywhere once again, but in a different way than my childhood. As my generation has reached middle age, the government and many companies use popular manga characters from nostalgic series to reach out to us. Some of the most striking examples use imagery from Gekiga. This style was developed in the 1960s by manga artists to appeal to more mature fans. It was created as a pushback against the cartoony style of the ubiquitous Osamu Tezuka's work. It used sharper line work and darker storylines that echoes the problems of Japanese society of the time. But to me, I always thought of Gekiga as a genre with the big eyebrows. Classic series like the boxing manga, Ashita no Joe, Tomorrow's Joe in English, and the James Bond-like Golgo 13 were favorites of the student protest counterculture. They were anti-authority symbols. But now the very same characters are being used by the authorities to remind people of rules. At the top, the Tokyo subway system has enlisted Ashita no Joe characters to advise about commuting during the pandemic. Note the mask. At the bottom, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is using the assassin Golgo 13 to advise international travelers of safety standards. Both of these really made me laugh when I saw them for the first time. These are just two of many examples. And of course, modern characters are used everywhere to appeal to younger consumers. It goes to show you how mainstream and successful manga are in Japanese society and around the world.
So I'm going to use that to segue right into my little presentation. And I just want to say it's always great to hear from Japanese people about this, because I was shocked when I first came to Japan in the 1990s and saw the kind of resistance that a lot of adults had toward manga and manga culture back then. It was so different. It's changed so much now. And manga are kind of, as Hiroko said, a cornerstone of Japan's not only cool Japan strategy, but it's sort of its face to the world. But when I grew up in the, as Hiroko said, we run this company called Alt Japan Co. Limited, a localization company, which is a big word for translation. And we've been doing this for the last 20 years or so. And as Hiroko said, we initially became interested in doing this work and we're mainly focusing on video games. One of the big reasons that we focused on video games is simply because the text in video games, there's so much more of it than in manga. So it's more lucrative for a company to focus on. You actually really need a big team with numerous employees to deliver the translations for video games. in a timely manner. But the other big reason is that, especially during the console era of video gaming in the 1980s and 1990s, the translations of video games were horrific. They were really, really bad. And it was shocking even to us as kids that the visual and the gameplay of these products was at such a high level and the English was so low. So that was one of the big reasons that I wanted to get into translation as a young person. And I was very lucky to have a public school, my local public school had the first ever Japanese language program taught at a public school in America in suburban Maryland. So I was able to kind of get an early start on studying Japanese. At that time, I was one of the only people in the entire class who was studying it for this reason. Most of the other people were interested in it because of business, because in the 1980s, Japan was this sort of financial powerhouse. Interestingly enough, this wasn't really a problem when it came to manga coming into the United States. I grew up during the big boom for translated manga in the 1980s. I actually checked Fred's book out of my junior high school library when it came out, and remember just reading it with fascination. It was amazing because at that time, when Fred's book came out, there weren't many examples of translated manga available at all. And it was actually quite frustrating to read Fred's book from a certain standpoint because he was talking about this great culture that we really couldn't access. But that was quickly about to change. And Fred touched on this before. A number of American comic book companies, ranging from Marvel on the East Coast to, in particular, a whole group of companies on the West Coast, began producing very high-level localized editions of Japanese comic books. Now, at this point in the mid-1980s, when companies like First and Eclipse and Viz and Dark Horse and Studio Proteus, which was a sort of studio, a translation studio that outsourced translations to other companies, they would pick comics in this era that were designed to appeal to American comic book readers, mainstream comic book readers. So you would see a lot of Japanese manga doesn't have a lot of superheroes in the sense that we think of like Batman and Superman and things like that. But there are, of course, superpowered sort of heroes and heroines. And so there was a lot of psychic kind of action, or cyborgs, or people piloting giant robots and things like that, that would fit more closely in with what American comic book readers of the time were sort of expecting from illustrated entertainment. And this is interesting because it's quite different from now. In the modern era, we young readers expect comic books to be released almost in real time from when they're released in America, from when they're released in Japan. And with very little alterations made to the content. They don't want it to be flopped. They don't want it to be localized or anything culturally changed. And this is because of these early pioneering comics that started coming out in the 80s, becoming a flood in the 1990s, that really served to inject Japanese artistic and creative sensibilities into the mainstream of America. At first at a kind of delay, and then increasingly in real time. So it's really thanks to the pioneers like Fred, like Dana Lewis, like Tauren Smith, and many, many others, that our tastes, that Japanese fantasies kind of became our own. And now young people, manga is almost a borderless sort of genre of entertainment now, or medium of entertainment now. It's, of course, made in Japan, and it's being made in Japan is very much part of its charm, but it's read by people all over the world, and because they understand it now. They get the tropes, they get the style, they get what Japanese artists are trying to say, because especially for young people, millennials, they've been raised on this since birth. You know, Fred came to this as an adult, I came to it as a teenager. But for young people today, there's not a single point in their lives when large amounts of Japanese illustrated entertainment weren't available. And I think, part of the reason why manga succeeds so much on the global marketplace is because it has such a long history. The history of illustrated entertainment in Japan goes back a very long way. You can even find examples of sort of proto-graphic novels as far back as the Edo period of the late 1700s and early 1800s. I love showing off this image. It is from a graphic novelization of a novel called Goketsu Jiraiya, Jiraiya the Hero. And it shows Princess Tsunade, the master of slugs, fighting against Orochimaru, a kind of evil ninja. these stories in the Jiraiya graphic novel series of the Edo era were, of course, mined and turned into the Naruto series of the 2000s. That is still one of the best-selling manga in the United States and abroad, all over the world today. You know, so we live in a very different era now than when I was growing up and when I was frustrated that I couldn't get my hands on manga. Now manga are available at every bookstore. They're available on Amazon. And like I said, they come out almost in real time. And you might think that this would mean that it is a sort of golden era for people who want to do translation as well. But actually, that's not really the case. Although the volume of manga has increased dramatically, the prices, the fees that companies are willing to pay to translate it have gone down in equally dramatic fashion from the early era of the 1980s and 1990s. And this is fueled by two reasons, one of which is because companies want to reduce their overhead. It's just how it goes. You know, you want to spend less so that you can make more profit. And but the bigger reason that they're able to do that is because there are so many young people out there who are willing and able to translate manga. When I was a kid, I said I was the only person in my class who was interested in studying Japanese because of pop culture. In April, I went to my alma mater, the University of Wisconsin at Madison, to kind of address the troops, the young Japanese majors and things like that. Every single one of them expressed an interest in wanting to try their hand at translating manga. So there's a huge number of young Americans, and I'm sure Europeans as well, who raised on manga want to translate it for themselves. So it's actually, I have to tell people who want to get into this as a career, it's actually very difficult to make a living at translating manga because the competition is so fierce. And quite frankly, the rates are a lot lower than they used to be. And they're lower than other forms of translation, non-entertainment translation, or even other forms of entertainment translation compared to video games and things like that. So that's just a kind of feature of the landscape these days. I have so much other stuff that I could talk about here. Hiroko and I spent a year translating Doraemon, and we've translated many video games. And as Fred touched on briefly at the end of his lecture, translation is just part of a much bigger localization effort. It's never just about a translator putting words down on a page, or more likely in a Word document or an Excel file. It is about a whole constellation of people involved in making manga as a product, as a business. There are stakeholders that run the companies that make this stuff. They're the creatives themselves, ranging, of course, from the manga artists, but also to the editors who in Japan work very closely with manga artists, especially at big successful operations like Shonen Jump, to kind of mold the content in accordance with what reader feedback is. On the linguistic front, it's not just the translators. There's localization managers, there's proofreaders, there's letterers. And then, of course, there's the distribution pipeline as well. So localization is not a one-person effort, even though it is possible for one person to translate a comic book, and many have. It is not possible for one person to get it out into the broader world as a whole. And it's kind of a testament to how much big business has come to focus on illustrated Japanese entertainment, that so much of it is available today. I think that's it for me. Why don't we switch to the next section of this? I'm going to de-share my screen. I think I just did. Have I de-shared? Yes. Excellent.
De-shared.
Is that a word? Did I localize English into English?
It is now a word. So thank you, first of all. Thank you to both of you. Between the three of you, there was a lot to pack, and I've got seriously pages of notes here. But I'll diverge from my original script. My original script was the moment we're in, which is we have some pioneering artists who passed on.
Yes.
How are people kind of discovering? What artists do they first discover? What are the artists that tend to hook readers? My own empirical answer to that as instructor at Berkeley is usually it's Miyazaki that people write about, right? But that's actually not the question I want to ask, but rather your diagram on all of the capabilities involved in localization was super fascinating, I think, for this group, right? There's the literal translation, but then there's cultural navigation, there's discovery, there's marketing, and And I guess I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, right? If you're a group here that's interested in manga, like where can you be investing in your taste making?
Right.
This is something that you're interested in. So maybe you can pick up on that.
Actually, before I say that, I wanted to say one really quick anecdote that Fred will enjoy. Right after I graduated from college, I actually called up Studio Proteus. I had to look them up in the phone book, and I picked up the phone and I dialed them, and I got Tauren Smith on the line, the pioneering gentleman who understood instinctively how important it was to start translating all of this stuff, and whose name I'd seen on so many translated comics. And I said, "It's an honor to speak to you, Mr. Smith. I just graduated with a degree in Japanese. How do I get a job at your company?" And he said, there's a pause, and he said, "Why would I hire you when I have Fred Schodt?" And I didn't really have an answer to that. I was like, good question. Well, nice talking to you.
Still working on that.
Exactly. And it would be many years before we actually started to get into manga translation through All Japan. But I thought you'd appreciate that. It was, you always had a defender in Tauren Smith, and it was a good point. I mean, it was, and that's another reason why it's such an honor to be here talking on the virtual stage with you. But yes, localization is a huge team effort. It is something that absolutely is codified, actually, especially in video game translation. But when it comes to manga translation, I always tell young people, find other people who are doing the job you're doing. Find other professional manga translators, hang out with them, talk to them, learn from them, because more than likely you're going to get a job from a fellow translator before you get a job as somebody without a credit from a translation company. You want to get recommended. And that is what I tell people.
Yeah, also the reasons why you have to work as a team. You think, Doraemon, for example, the Doraemon is a manga targeted for the small children. That means the word count, Japanese character count, small.
It's very low.
And the sentence is so short, and it's targeting kids. So you would think it's really easy to translate, but it's difficult. It has a difficult part because it's younger children. So there's no context about the culture. So when it's challenging for us, when we worked on the Doraemon, it actually, the frame, it doesn't contain the conversation bubble. That was the hardest one. The frame was, Doraemon was sitting on the kotatsu, the heating table. And then he was watching the TV. On the TV screen, there is Shishimai, that is a lion dancing, which is typical. You see it on a New Year's Day. So as Japanese, when you see it, it's like, Doraemon is watching a TV on a New Year's Day. That's it. But if you don't know that, the kotatsu, the context is lost. The kotatsu really looks like bed, because the huge duvet was over on the table. So the little kid probably would think, Doraemon is sick, and he's watching TV. And then it's just so that all the season reference is gone. Yep. And then the enjoyment, celebratory feeling is gone, but there is no bubble of the conversation. So, okay, what are we going to do? And then the whole purpose of manga is entertaining readers. And then, for what's it called? The ones translated that the targeting adults. We saw that on the last screen. That well, anyway, if the audience is the older generations, and then it's okay to put in the footnotes. But for the children, elementary school kids, no way they're going to read the footnotes. So you have to be creative. How you can the story goes without losing the young readers, and that's really challenging. And in order to do so, you have to team up, and with the native discuss what we should do the best, and that's really think it's a key.
Yeah.
So if this is something you're interested in, then find someone else. And I would suspect
that
discovery process
partnering helps.
You don't have to get married, but
one does, right? When you lots of punchlines there, but anyway, Kendra, our crack Zoom ninja here, has been taking questions over Zoom, and they're actually better than the ones I had prepared. So I'm going to start incorporating questions that have come through. And I think I'm interpreting this one correctly. It's from James Easterly, who talks about the outbound influence of manga and how that's influenced artists, people, consumers. But in turn, those artists have created their own content, and that's come back in and maybe influenced subsequent generations of artists. So if you could speak to that cycle. Matt, I know that's that's in Pure Invention a little bit, so maybe there's something there. And Fred, if you have any comment on that.
Fred, do you have any comment on that? I before I start blabbering.
I think that the question is to me a little bit vague, but one thing I can say is that Japanese manga art and of course anime art has really heavily influenced artists in the United States, particularly comic book artists. You can see at a certain point in history, the eyes start getting a little bit bigger in the United States. And of course, artists in the United States, all artists, not just in the United States, all comic book artists, manga artists, bande dessinée artists, they're always looking at what other people are doing. So they're heavily absorbing Japanese styles. And I really noticed that because I'm actually on the executive committee of the Japan International Manga Award right now. And we get submissions. It's under the auspices of the Foreign Ministry of Japan, but there are submissions now from all over the world. Not everybody draws in Japanese style, but you can tell that everybody is aware of Japanese manga and is reading them and is being influenced by manga. And it's quite extraordinary to see the variety of submissions now. They come from hundreds of countries around the world. And then the awards are, there's usually an award ceremony. And this is sort of my advertisement for any artists who are in the audience, but the award ceremony is usually held in February and March. So for the pandemic, they haven't had in-person award ceremonies. But just this, I believe it was in February, there was a Zoom or a global virtual award ceremony. And the winners were from Taiwan and also from Holland and then Spain. Some of them were done in bande dessinée style, which is the European wonderful style of drawing. But they're all influenced in some way by Japanese manga. Mm-hmm. And one of the winners, ironically, was actually from Ukraine. There were two people who received the Silver Award. And they were obviously unable to come because of the pandemic to the award ceremony, but they also could not participate in the Zoom virtual ceremony because I'm sure there were security issues. Yeah. But it's just an illustration, and the award, the Japan International Manga Award, it really illustrates how Japanese manga and pop culture in general have really been transmitted all around the world now and are heavily influencing, and it's heavily influencing people.
If I could just add to that really quickly, during Pure Invention, unfortunately, I wasn't able to use this part in the book, but I interviewed an American animator by the name of Tim Eldred, who is also a pioneering sort of anime a fan in the United States. And he's been working in Hollywood for quite some time. He directs many of the Marvel animated series. And he told me that around the early to mid 1990s, there was a huge influx of new animators in Hollywood who came in specifically because they'd been influenced by anime. That was their introduction to animation, not Fleischer Brothers, not Disney, but anime. And over the course of that decade, they really revolutionized the way that Hollywood animated things. Not just making characters with slightly bigger eyes or superficial things like that, but framing, lighting. They borrowed techniques from Japan, incorporated it into American art. And so you see that sort of influence subtly going on now in Hollywood today, where a lot of people who are raised on anime and manga are doing this sort of thing. Angus MacLean, who is the director of the Buzz Lightyear movie, is a huge collector of Japanese toys and anime. I've met him several times. There's a lot of people out there who have kind of anime in their blood and manga in their blood, making content that's now gone mainstream in the United States.
You can have a comment?
Actually, I had a question. Actually, our original questioner.
We can just keep going on this.
Wants to append. So actually, James, if you're ready, I think you're ready to embellish a little bit. And then I have a question from another audience member about a specific IP that I want to get to. So James.
Can everybody hear me well? Great. First of all, thank you all for putting this on. I really appreciate it. So to expand on my question, a lot of people have been influenced by the art and works of manga. So my question is, in turn, how has that influence, from your perspective, influenced back on Japanese comics? And how has that influenced translators to take works from outside of Japan and bring it to Japan?
My sense is very little. I don't think Japanese creators really take foreign ones into consideration when they're making their art. And ironically, I think that is a big reason of why it so appeals to people abroad. It gives it a sort of authenticity. It doesn't feel like something that's marketed or designed to appeal to anyone. It really has the kind of individuality of the creator in it. So, I mean, Miyazaki Hayao has famously said, I have no idea why foreign people watch my movies, and I don't really care. It's great, but I'm making them for me. And that's, I think, the Japanese craftsmanship and craftspersonship that drives the vibrancy of this of illustrated entertainment in Japan.
The kind of a pending question, and then get to a question from a Stuart Artkin about a specific IP, but that's, you know, the home market is shrinking. And as is not so secular shrinkage in terms of demographics, further you have print media shrinkage, which is a worldwide phenomenon. And I'm wondering if that relates to this question here about international markets and international audiences, and how important are those to publishers, for example?
Fred?
I was thinking of the previous question more.
Well, obviously, I think the foreign market is very important to Japanese publishers. It is. Nobody is trying to cut off foreign markets, and actually they're expanding into them very dramatically. You know, you look at Sony purchasing Crunchyroll, for instance, or Netflix aggressively going into the anime market and dumping a lot of money into Japanese studios. So Japanese studios. Really, I think that's more of a question, I think, for the animated side of things, because anime is much more able to fit into kind of pre-existing pipelines of entertainment than manga is in a lot of ways. And manga, I think, is really purely like focused on the domestic marketplace in terms of creativity. In terms of marketing, of course, Japanese companies know there's a big market to be made there. That's why Shonen Jump, for instance, is available in English in real time. Episodes coming out as soon as they come out in Japan. And part of that's because the Japanese recognize there's a market there. A big part of it is also to get ahead of scanlators, which are people who are willing to translate manga for free and take money away from the creators that should go into the creators' pockets. And as a kind of way to get around this, a lot of publishers have started to release their stuff immediately. So it's a defensive and a offensive. I don't know if it's offensive, but a kind of a measure that way. Also,
I'd like to mention that there's a difference. Today there's a huge hunger from the consumers, in abroad. Back in time, there's no internet, yeah. So the company has to market well. But still, it takes a long time to localize, and then a half year later, and finally, look at the movie, for example, that when Japanese see the Hollywood movie, we had to wait for half a year when I was in high school. Yeah. And then, but today, there's the social network services, wonderful tools. And then also everybody's become otaku, not Japanese, non-Japanese, whatever, they're really interested in and consume more. There's content. A huge hunger for Japanese content. So I think because it's a high rise, all the consumers in abroad are so keen what's happening in Japan. Yes. So the Kimetsu no Yaiba, the Demon Slayer, for example, in my mind, that anime and that manga is so Japanese. I mean, the context is Japanese, and then, the translation demon right there. I have so many things to tell you about the localizing that one term. But anyway, for the marketing purposes, I understand they chose demon because it's easy to understand for the people abroad. Anyway, but still, it's right there. Even one word is so difficult it had contained a lot of Japanese culture, but it's a huge a hit. And instantly hit too. Japan got hit, and then America got hit huge. So That's difference
The
today.
market has changed.
The market got changed.
The pipelines
Kind of rapid grassroots level to pick up the stuff in Japan.
Can I say something?
Yeah. And I'm supposed to.
Is Fred allowed to talk?
Here they go. But so when Fred wants to talk, people listen. So
No, I just wanted to say something which is not so optimistic and mention that in the comics world, in the manga world in Japan, there is a fairly closed aspect to it. So it's very difficult for foreign artists, for example, to be published in Japan. That's just an unfortunate aspect. And I've had a very sad moment once when I took Will Eisner as part of a project to Japan. It was sponsored by Tesco Productions. They were trying to get Japanese artists and publishers more interested in American works. And Will Eisner is like the god of comics in America. He's this foundational artist. And we went to a company, a famous company in Tokyo, which was known for occasionally publishing foreign artists. Not very many, but once in a while. And I sat there as the editor said, well, you have to redraw your work completely. You have to draw it to Japanese format. You have to redraw it so it reads from right to left instead of left to right. So there's a lot of inflexibility built into the Japanese system, whether it's animation or whether it's manga. And Will Eisner was 80 years old, and he said, my works have been sold in over 80 countries around the world, and I've never had to redraw anything. And it was a bitter experience. So there is a closed aspect in Japan, which makes it more difficult for American artists or foreign artists in general to become successful. And this is very frustrating, I think, to artists in the US or around the world who want to enter the Japanese market.
So technically, I'm supposed to cut the networking now, but a promise is a promise. So Stuart Arkin, who's online, had an interesting question about a specific IP, which is Ultraman. And,
Ultraman.
Stuart, if you're online, please fire away. And then there's some interesting questions from the audience about translator resources.
Ultraman isn't really a manga, though. That's a tokusatsu series. That's kind of beyond the scope of this talk.
Okay. The question is, Stuart, do you want to append if you're available? The question I had received was Tsurabaya Productions and the deployment and re-release of Ultraman here stateside.
Sorry, no idea.
Okay. I'm going to do one more, which I think is an interesting question generically, which is resources for translating onomatopoeia. You probably
wow, we had a whole section on
a
this.
whole section.
Zaza.
Yeah.
And Shin.
Yes, our favorite.
Giseigo and Gitaigo that make Japanese manga sing. Like, how would you start?
This is one reason why I don't think that machine translation or AI will ever replace manga translators, because there is so little one-to-one correlation between especially onomatopoeia, but also things like fixed phrases, itadakimasu, which you say before you eat, or yoroshiku onegaishimasu. They're so contextual and based on the situation. Hiroko and I actually built our own list of terms that we use. And I think most translators do that. There aren't any dictionaries of onomatopoeia because there's no set way of doing the mean of cicada in English that people are instantly going to get. Is it chirp, chirp? Do you do mean? Do you do buzz, buzz? You know, there's a million ways of doing it. Fred, do you have any tips?
I have some comments. I could talk for hours about this. I think that eventually AI will be able to do most manga translations. I personally, as a translator, I've never found that the onomatopoeia was that big a problem, although people in Japan like to talk about how difficult it is and how could you possibly translate that. That's for a translator, that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem I've had, and this relates to something that Hiroko said earlier, is when you have a visual pun, because comics are tied, the illustrations are tied with the words. And if there's a visual pun, it's very, very difficult to create a translation that will work in that situation. But in terms of AI, I don't know if you've been following some of the progress that's been made in Google Translate. It's really quite uncanny. And we're not at the point where it could pass the Turing test probably, but we're getting very close. And in a 4 or 5 years, I don't think there's going to be much market for a translation at all. A lot of it will be done by AI, and then you'll have an editor to check things. And that's just a reality that we're facing, because I think that if you think of the fact that big data, most artificial intelligence is based on vast amounts of big data and number crunching power and just a little bit of real AI, when you have access to aggregate human information, 6 billion people's life information, when you have access to that, well, an individual is not going to be able to compete. So anyway, I could go on and on and on, and I'm sure you understand.
Okay, I have actually counter argument. Probably just because I am Japanese. Maybe I'm believing the craftsmanship, I guess. But the language, I think it's a culture. And I mean, maybe eventually the AI is going to take over, maybe. But I think there are level of the needs from the consumers, and say, if you want to just read a manga quickly, dirty way, whatever, or the certain level of quality, and then probably AI can help you. But probably, I personally, but still, I believe that there's no correct answer for localization, the translation. I'm not talking about mistranslation. I'm not talking about that. But I'm talking about because the language is a culture. So 95%, it depends on the translator's choice, the sensibility. And then that means it's just the possibility is endless crap, beauty. I don't know. It's just fun. I mean, it's just so that AI, I mean, maybe eventually AI would take over, but I really believe in that the craftsmanship.
There's always room for Fred. Yeah. That's what we're trying to say. I'll pay for Fred's translations over AI.
Exactly. So AI, if AI teaches, say Dazai Osamu, the style translations, or or the Fred's, the deep Fred style. I mean, you have done so many works. So of course AI can learn, and then if that AI manages to personalize it, probably. Well, and then for the standardized
Cyber Fred.
I don't know.
One comment.
Here's my question then. Given what you said, now and then part I'm trying to get to an optimistic note, but but given what you said, which I philosophically agree with at a high level, humans and tastemakers exist at the edge, and they find niches that are valuable given advances in the machine, right? And that's what I suspect Alt Japan is doing, and a lot of you as professionals are doing. Yeah, the machine's getting better, therefore I'm going to skate ahead of it a little bit or find some analog, high crafty, value add place to be. And so that's kind of how I'd love to hear your thought on that.
Can I say?
Please.
I love to talk about this subject.
Yes.
It's very dear to my heart. Doesn't matter if you don't know. But we didn't talk, we mentioned, there was a mention, it was quite brief, about scanlation. And scanlation has really revolutionized the ability of young people around the world to enjoy comics. Scanlation is a process where with modern technology, with Photoshop, you can very easily translate your own comic or the comic that you like from Japan, manga that you like, and you can put it on the web where everybody can read it. It's done for free. People love to translate their favorite mangas, which are sometimes not available in English otherwise. It's a huge, huge endeavor. And I can guarantee that a lot of the scanlation translators are probably using Google Translate for a lot of the translations they're doing. And they work in teams around the world. It's a virtual world. And they will sometimes use Google Translate probably, and then embellish it with maybe they know some Japanese friend in the town they live in Belgrade or wherever. And they produce something that is good enough. And that's something we often forget about in terms of business, because there's an area you get into which is good enough. And we're already seeing that in a lot of areas. Yes. And I just want to say one last thing about AI, because I worked on a very interesting project just at the beginning of the pandemic. And it was an AI generated manga. In other words, at Tezuka Productions, Tezuka himself has been dead since 1989. But they took very limited AI capabilities, and they were able to construct a story that Tezuka probably would have written,
Right.
using drawings that Tezuka probably would have used and characters that he probably would have created, and create a brand new manga, basically by Tezuka Osamu, who doesn't exist anymore. And that's, you know, we're headed into a new world. I hate to say it, but that's the truth.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yep.
I translated it. It's not the best manga in the world, but you know, we're just at the beginning of this stage of things.
Yes.
It's going to get really interesting.
Yes.
Sorry.
No worries.
I could go on and on.
Yeah, I'm going to bring in one, and this is probably a less, well, a simpler question to answer. And that is, do you plan to update Manga anytime soon?
Oh no, manga would be impossible for me to create today.
Okay.
It's just not possible.
Because of
rights
IP
issues,
holders, yeah.
The rights issues are so complex, and everybody thinks that they'll make $1 million or a zillion yen, because the yen's not worth much anymore, if they could sell something to the United States. When I wrote manga, artists were happy to cooperate, with a couple exceptions, but they just loved the idea that some foreigners might actually read their works. And that was a different era, because very few people outside of Japan knew what manga were. People weren't even eating sushi very much. It's a totally different world.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons Pure Invention isn't that heavily illustrated, because they were the amounts of money that people were asking to use like little thumbnails was absurd. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars for single images. And I was able to negotiate down in a couple of cases with people like, you know, who understood, like the Tezuka people, the Mushi Pro people, the Sony people, but others, you know, if you don't see images in there of characters you might like, you might want to ask yourself why.
Yeah, we talked a lot about that in email while you were writing it.
We did a lot of back and forth on that, didn't we? Because I was trying to do something a little bit more image heavy like you had done.
It's just very difficult now.
It is.
That is a question I had as a reader, actually. So that explains the answer to that.
Yes.
With that, I want to get to networking so people here can talk to each other. I assume we have facility for those online to do so. But first, I want to thank our guests for lending their time, insight, experiences on this topic. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm sorry I talked too much. I could talk forever about this subject.
And we would listen.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Hiroko.
Thank you. Thank you. No, this was great. It's an honor. It's always an honor.
Building bridges between the United States and Japan since 1905. Japan Society.